And so the drama began in Melbourne. The Formula 2 race was cancelled because of the heavy rain. The Formula 1 grid assembled with drizzle, and then the drizzle went away, but everybody was on intermediates. Well, Lance Stroll initially opted for full wets, but then he too switched to intermediates just before the formation lap. On the formation lap, it was greasy, it was slippery, particularly on the curbs, particularly on the white lines. It caught out Isaac Hadjar in the second Racing Bulls. He crashed into the Tech Pro barrier, not to restart, actually reduced to tears, such was his frustration. But it was quite a vicious move he was making on the steering at that specific moment. So he will look at that in slow-mo, and I guess he'll look at the way Lando and Max and a few others were doing that formation lap. Of course, that delayed the start, but nonetheless, conditions more or less the same when the start proper was given, and it was Lando Norris protecting that pole position. Beautiful start from the pole. Great start too from Oscar Piastri alongside him in the other McLaren, and good start too from Max Verstappen in the Red Bull. So Lando needed to have done that. He did it beautifully. Max had the run going towards the braking area into turn one, started to move towards the inside. Lando had to move left to protect that position. Wasn't a big deal, but it was enough to leave the door open for Oscar Piastri. If he wanted to make a dive down the inside, this was the moment he was going to do it. But he didn't. He didn't do a Hungary. He didn't do a Monza. He gave the corner to Lando Norris correctly, obviously. But in so doing, of course, he lost a little bit of momentum. He hugged the inside going into turn one, hugged the inside going into turn two. And Max Verstappen on the outside of turn two, where it was wet, just blew past Oscar Piastri on the outside to take P2 on the run down into turn three. The pass of the race for sure on the outside of the wet of Oscar Piastri. Anyway, they get to the braking area for turn three. This is the best part of the road for Lando Norris, and he was absolutely pin sharp perfect through there on that opening lap. But behind him, mayhem, because Jack Doohan had gone off in the Alpine. He touched a white line on the straight and it just lost the rear, and it flicked round, got into an aquaplane and hit the Tech Pro barriers. He was okay, but that brought out the first of the afternoon safety cars. So now we had a safety car procession with Lando Norris and Max Verstappen between the two McLarens. A somewhat different situation to qualifying already. And I guess many people were saying, can Max win this race? Can he do it? Can he do it? Of course, it kind of depended on what was going to happen with the weather. At this point, there was no real threat of heavy rain. Indeed, it was getting lighter and lighter. And the intermediates, after about 4 or 5 laps, were starting to overheat. Lando and Max both having to go into wet parts of the road in order to protect them. Anyway, at the restart, Lando again did a great job. Max tried to push him quite hard early on, but then it was very clear that his tyres were going off quicker than those of the two McLarens. Oscar Piastri pulled right up behind Max and eventually forced Max into an error. With the tyres going off on the Red Bull, he locked up going into a tight right-hander towards the end of the lap, and Oscar Piastri took then second place back from Max. Max was then on his own under no pressure at all from George Russell in the Mercedes, who was some 8 seconds behind him. But now it was Lando Norris versus Oscar Piastri. And here we saw a really clear indication of where Oscar Piastri is with his driving. They were very close. It was relatively easy for Oscar to pull up behind Lando Norris because Lando was going as slowly as he wanted to go in order to stay in front, obviously in the lead, and that was Oscar's marker, so he could catch him just about everywhere. But he was doing so with wide entries, with late braking, with all the things that we saw from Oscar Piastri at the back end of last year. So the news is he hasn't gone back to his short corner, very compact way of driving that we saw early in his McLaren career. He's now effectively driving exactly the same way as Lando Norris, except that, of course, Lando is a little bit softer with his inputs and makes fewer mistakes as a result, and he's massaging the car a little bit more. But in terms of the way they approach the corner, where they're putting the power down, pretty much spot on, identical now. So in this situation, if this continues for the year, no doubt at all, Lando Norris is going to easily beat Oscar Piastri because he's going to make fewer mistakes and he's softer with his inputs all round. The only way Oscar was ever going to do anything with Lando would be if he could start to go back to being a real short corner driver and doing something different, particularly on the slow and medium speed corners. And there is one other point to make, which is that you would have imagined when Oscar was behind Max in the opening phase of the race, that he would have been thinking, yeah, this is how Max drives. I've forgotten to do that, or something along those lines. But it didn't do that. And then that's partly because Max wasn't actually using short corners in the early laps of the race any more than anybody else was. Very difficult to do that when it's a drying groove and you've just got to be on the dry groove that is there from all the race cars. So what Max was using in that early phase of the race, like Lando, was his incredibly soft touch and feel. And that was what, of course, is very difficult to see if you're following another car or indeed watching it on television or anywhere else. All you're seeing is a car that isn't twitchy, that other drivers are finding twitchy. So that was why Oscar probably didn't change anything and is still the driver that he was in qualifying, which is, a Lando Norris clone, but without Lando's softness of touch. So Lando Norris, under pressure from Oscar Piastri, looked absolutely calm and totally in control, driving beautifully. And of course, there was real pressure on Lando because Oscar Piastri received a radio message saying, remember, Oscar, you're free to race. Just remember the rules, whatever that means. It's a bit like Christian Horner saying, race one another, but don't get too close. Anyway, Oscar was doing a good job there, putting pressure on Lando. The crowd were going wild. But then on lap 34, it all changed because that's when Fernando Alonso, of all people, twice world champion, very experienced driver, lost the Aston Martin, hit the wall, brought out the safety car. And at this point, the rain had stopped. The intermediate tyres were going off. So everybody barreled in either for medium slicks or hard slicks. Medium in the case of the Red Bulls, Max Verstappen. Hard in the case of McLaren, Mercedes and Ferrari. The safety car was out for quite a long time, 4 laps indeed. And when it pulled in, very, very dark clouds were already over the circuit again. They were all on slicks now, but quite clearly some heavy rain was on the way. And sure enough, 2 laps later on lap 44, both McLarens had a major drama at the third last corner of the lap. The tight right-hander at the end of with the fast approach. First of all, Lando in the lead, ran wide, kept it together beautifully and managed to get it on track with a little bit of oversteer on the grass, but managed to get back on. Obviously a bit sheepish at this point, came out of the throttle. Oscar saw that, but he then too ran wide. Maybe he lost concentration as a result of seeing Lando make that mistake, but it was a much bigger drama for Oscar because he lost it on that right-hander and then kept his foot in it to the point where he then lost it going into the tight left, the second last corner of the lap. Very, very tight left-hander, ran wide onto the grass and was beached on the grass for far too long, enough to drop him way down the field. Eventually managed to reverse himself out with the wheels massively spinning and got back on track. But that was effectively the end of Oscar Piastri's challenge on slicks in the wet. Lando Norris pulled straight into the pit lane and went back onto intermediates. Max Verstappen did likewise. So now we had a restart behind the safety car of Lando leading Max, leading George Russell, Alex Albon, and then Kimi Antonelli, who's going very well in the Mercedes. As I said yesterday, this amongst all the rookies is the driver that does have a soft touch in terms of being able to create short corners on slow and medium speed turns, and he did that really well in the wet. I said yesterday that he's very, very aggressive with his inputs on fast corners, but of course that wasn't really an issue. He did have a spin coming out of a left-hander, quite a quick left-hander by the cricket club there. But overall, this wasn't a massive issue in this race on intermediate because everybody was kind of line-locked on the drying line on intermediates through the faster corners. So he was basically doing what everybody else did on those corners and then making up ground. More importantly, he wasn't filling the car with spiky inputs that suddenly caused the back end to go or the front to go, as a lot of other drivers were complaining about. Car was very skittish. With a driver like Antonelli and a driver like Max, driver to some extent like Lando given his inputs. So anyway, getting back to the front of the race, it was now Lando Norris from Max Verstappen, and it was close, very close. Max got within DRS range of Lando in the closing laps. It was all over him on the last lap, but could do nothing and crossed the line only 0.8 of a second behind Lando to finish second. But Lando, of course, to win the opening round of the World Championship, very deservedly so, from the pole. Absolutely stunning drive. Just that one mistake when he ran wide on slicks in the wet, but we'll forgive him for that one. Otherwise, he really showed it to Oscar Piastri, and that was the key takeaway from this race. George Russell, a lonely third in the factory Mercedes, tried to give Max a bit of a push at the final restart when they're all back on slicks again. He's on the hard tyre, Max is on the medium, but Max again started to pull away. It was a little bit like the way Max pulled away initially from Oscar Piastri in the opening laps of the race. Oscar would have a jink here, a jink there, would just move the car a little bit when Max wasn't, and it was enough to give Max maybe 0.05 and then 0.1, 0.2. That was the difference. Very small differences, and it was a little bit the same between Max and George. George really good through the first couple of corners, but then over the lap, there would be a slight mistake and Max would get away from him. Anyway, good drive by George. Very good drive by George to finish third. Kimi Antonelli, really good drive to finish behind George, effectively in P4 on the road. Excellent debut by him for the reasons I've already stated. But he then got demoted to P5 due to an unsafe pit release, giving P4 to another driver who drove beautifully, and that was Alex Albon in the Williams Mercedes. Kept the car on the fairway all afternoon. Carlos Sainz unlucky on what was effectively the slow lap behind the safety car once the Jack Doohan accident had happened. Towards the end of that lap, Carlos had a problem with an upshift in the safety car mode and just caught the rear and flicked him into the Tech Pro barriers just before the pit lane. So very unfortunate afternoon for Carlos. But nonetheless, a very, very good drive by Alex Albon and Williams for P4, as I say, because of that penalty to Kimi Antonelli. And Lance Stroll drove very well to finish P6 for Aston Martin. Again, on a day when normally you'd expect him to be getting involved with quite a lot of drama, he too absolutely out there, making no mistakes and just bringing the car home. Very, very good drive into P6 on a day, as I say, when his very experienced double world champion teammate put it in the wall. After being caught up by some gravel online on a quick corner, inevitably one of the variables of racing in these conditions. Nico Hulkenberg, excellent in P7 after a disappointing qualifying for Sauber. Classic Nico Hulkenberg race drive. I did give him a bit of a hard time in a live stream recently, saying he wasn't that good in the last 20, 30 laps of the race. But on this occasion, just fabulous. What a great race drive by Nico Hulkenberg. So I take all that back, Nico. Beautiful drive. And he finished ahead of the two Ferraris. Charles Leclerc ahead of Lewis Hamilton. Really disappointing performance from both of those. And eventually, Oscar Piastri caught Lewis on the last lap and passed him on the outside of the 9-10, very fast sector in the wet. And there's a lot of weird radio transmissions going on with Ferrari as well, almost becoming uncomfortable, with Charles Leclerc giving his engineer a hard time for saying the water that you're feeling in the cockpit, by which he meant must be from the water bottle, but he didn't say all that. And then Charles said, well, yeah, thanks for stating the obvious. I know that'll go viral and everybody will think it's very funny. But I don't think it's particularly funny in the middle of a race when an engineer quite clearly is trying to help the driver. Anyway, that was that. And then on the Lewis side, they were giving Lewis quite a lot of instructions on how to try to get past Alex Albon to do with the DRS and various switches. And he kept saying, I can handle it, I can handle it. Well, Lewis, you didn't handle it. And you never got past Alex Albon. And I think for a Ferrari driver to get beaten, admittedly in his first Grand Prix, for him to get outraced by Alex Albon in a Williams is a bit embarrassing, to be honest. And I was a bit surprised that Lewis was taking that rather dogmatic approach on the radio, because I'm sure on the pit wall they were thinking, what is going on here? Why can't he get past him? Pierre Gasly finished 11th. Sad for him to be out of the points. Did a good job all weekend. And Oliver Berman, amazingly, kept it on the island and actually finished on the road. He passed quite a lot of cars, but he passed cars when he was unlapping himself when the safety car came out. But he kept more or less pace with Esteban Ocon, his teammate at Haas Ferrari. But a terrible weekend for Haas. But a great weekend, as we say, for Lando Norris. What a way to start his 2025 campaign. I love saying that because it sounds like, yeah, the campaign has started and Lando's on the go. And yeah, just beautiful. Hugged his mum and dad when he got out of the car. Different finishing procedure in Parc Fermé now. Nice to see the winner drive into the garage, and we don't have the green room stuff. And it's a little bit more organised. And yeah, really nice moment when Lando got out of the car. None of the fist pumping, jumping around, just calmly got out, shook hands with Max. Max and George shook hands as well. Good to see. Well, they did something. They rubbed shoulders, I think, something like that. And yeah, very good all round. Oscar Piastri will be feeling sick as a dog, I suspect, because this was his moment and it's gone now. So, and Lando not only won the Australian Grand Prix, but he's won a big initial battle, not even a skirmish, a big battle with Oscar Piastri as to who is going to get, if there's going to be a world champion at McLaren, who it's going to be. And it's not only because he won the race, but because of the way he won the race, his faultless driving, or apart from that one mistake, and the way he got the pole as well. And that's a lot for Piastri to take and try to react to and come back ahead of Lando. Almost impossible now, I think. And we can watch more of it in the Chinese Grand Prix coming up this weekend. It's a sprint weekend as well, unfortunately, but nonetheless, it is the Chinese Grand Prix, so bring it on. See you then.